Willkommen, bienvenue, and welcome to Eddie's Encyclopedia of Musicals. I am Eddie, and I wanted to talk today about lyrics in musical theater. Musical theater lyrics are my jam. I love listening to them, and I love breaking them down, and I love writing them. But today I want to talk about them. My point of interest today is the topic of realism in musical theater lyrics. Realism in musical theater may sound oxymoronic. This is, after all, the genre of media where people spontaneously burst into song and dance in the streets, and we all just sort of accept that. But there is some level of realism that the audience expects in their musicals. People have told me how they didn't like The Greatest Showman because the music didn't evoke a circus vibe. There are so many reasons to dislike The Greatest Showman. That one didn't register on my radar, but it did for some. Likewise, in discussing the dueling Wild Parties, a common criticism is that Andrew Lippa's score feels too anachronistic, being very modern, while Michael John LaChiusa's music better captures the feel of a 1920s party. Going away from music to other elements of the shows, I've seen several productions of Jesus Christ Superstar that use crosses in some meaningful way throughout the show, and that really breaks immersion. That example always amuses me for how unintentionally ominous that the sets or the costume designs become. What with Mary Magdalene, who is so devoted to Jesus, bearing a prominent cross tattoo on her arm or something. It's just so out of place. Let's stick with Jesus Christ Superstar for a moment, because there's so much that can be done with that show. What does realism mean for Jesus Christ Superstar? I have seen many versions of it, some with biblical costumes, some with punk rock clothes with riot gear on the cops, some in modern workout gear, such as the latest tour. You can do pretty much anything with the costuming in Jesus Christ Superstar, and I'll not question it much. The crosses are a step too far, though. Why am I so ambivalent with regards to the costuming in Jesus Christ Superstar? A big part of it is the anachronism of the score. It's a rock opera that sounds very 1970, and it uses plenty of 70s British lingo. It doesn't try at all to fit the historical context. Is that bad? I don't think so. Not demanding that it matches the Roman Empire in AD 33 allows it to be updated to any time and era. This helps show how the themes can be relevant today as much as they were 2,000 years ago. Of course, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't set historical musicals in one time and place. Sweeney Todd is just as relevant today as it is in its fictional realization of 19th century England, even though it's unlikely to see a Sweeney in jeans. Actually, jeans were created around the time Sweeney Todd takes place, so I guess that wouldn't be so far-fetched, but I think many of us would find it immersion-breaking. Anyway, what does any of this have to do with lyrics? Well, Tim Rice, who wrote Jesus Christ Superstar, and Stephen Sondheim, who wrote Sweeney Todd, and many other lyricists from the 1960s on, have really pushed for realism in their lyrics in one way or another. Rice gave an interview in a Backstage article about how he wrote characters like Eva Peron. He specifically called out lyricists like Lorenz Hart and Cole Porter for having lyrics that don't fit the characters. He states that a character like Eva, hailing from the lower class and speaking to the lower class, wouldn't sing something like bewitched, bothered, and bewildered. She'd use simpler language more befitting her circumstances. Sondheim makes a similar argument in his book Finishing the Hat. He gripes about his own lyrics in West Side Story's I Feel Pretty, saying that the use of internal rhyme doesn't suit the character of Maria, but rather is an instance of the lyricist bleeding into the lyrics, desperate to show off his own cleverness. Maria shouldn't use sophisticated or complicated language, Sondheim says, because not only is English her second language, but in particular, the English she's been exposed to is the kind of English being spoken by gang members in the streets of New York. Sondheim argues that ought to be reflected in the lyrics that she sings, and that the way that he wrote I Feel Pretty is a bad example of that. So what does this mean for lyricists trying to capture this kind of realism? Should they write accents into their songs? Well, that gets really tricky. Let's take a look at Oscar Hammerstein, who happened to be Sondheim's mentor. Hammerstein loved writing accents into his lyrics. From I Can't Say No to Western People Funny, Hammerstein's lyrics are full of imitations of how people who weren't native speakers of standard American English spoke. But that's the problem, isn't it? It's imitations. Hammerstein was a lyricist, not a linguist. He could hear the differences in how people spoke, but that doesn't mean he could understand when or why those differences occurred, let alone accurately implement them in his writing. For example, The King and I takes place in what was then called Siam, what is now called Thailand. Thus, Hammerstein wrote his version of a Thai accent into his lyrics. This includes dropping copulas. A copula is a word like is or are, which ties a subject to an adjective. For example, he is wise, or they are funny. Hammerstein used copula deletion in the chorus of the song Western People Funny. There are a few problems with this. One is that Lady Thiang actually uses copulas on a regular basis throughout the show, just not in the chorus of this song. So she sounds more foreign or less adept at English when it suited Hammerstein to make her so. He didn't commit to the accents, and he didn't put in the effort to make them consistent. Another big problem is that the Thai language has copulas, so it's unlikely that copula deletion would be a common error that Hammerstein would have heard among Thai ESL speakers in New York. It's absolutely possible for an individual Thai speaker to struggle with the correct use of copulas when learning English. I'm just saying it's unlikely to be so universal among these speakers that it is a hallmark of a Thai English accent. Copula dropping is a phenomenon which linguists call zero copula when it occurs naturally in a language, and it actually appears more in African American English. So it appears that Hammerstein was taking an accent feature he heard from one marginalized group and pinning it on another because what mattered wasn't the accuracy of the accent, but rather the demonstration that these characters spoke what was perceived as broken English. And rather than trying to find accurate depictions of Thai English, which many 1950s theatergoers might not have been familiar with, he went with a more familiar example of broken English and said, close enough. I need to take a moment here to pull out my linguist card and state that there is no such thing as broken English, that term is usually used with a racist connotation, and that all languages and dialects are equal and wonderful. Anyway, back to Hammerstein. Sondheim, who, as I said, was mentored by Hammerstein, criticized Hammerstein in his book Finishing the Hat, essentially saying that Hammerstein's characters were caricatures, cloaked in accents and other kinds of characteristics that don't contribute to actual depth or personality. Indeed, Sondheim's characters, like George from Sunday in the Park with George and Fosca from Passion, are much more widely discussed in terms of character depth and development than Nellie from South Pacific or Ado Annie from Oklahoma. But guess who liked to use accents too? That's right, the guy who we've already quoted in demanding realism in lyrics tried his hand at incorporating accents into his own lyrics. It's not surprising that he did. If you're looking for realism in lyrics, wouldn't some of the first things you'd look for be that the words matched the words and the sounds matched the dialects of the characters? So how did Sondheim do? Well, he started in 1957, so he did about as well as you'd expect. In West Side Story, Anita makes a weird mistake in an idiom at the beginning of America. Anita is shown to be very skilled in her use of English throughout the show. I don't believe it's ever explicitly addressed in any version other than the 2021 movie, but Anita makes very few errors in her English, yet she completely messes up this idiom. Why? It worked for a rhyme. Another example of a lyricist using an accent when it suited him, and rarely elsewhere. This is also a weird example of an error. Put that in your pipe and smoke it is an idiom. It doesn't mean what it looks like it means. It's one of those phrases that you learn from hearing. You don't just generate it on your own. Anita knows this idiom but gets it backwards? That's just odd. Anyway, what about later Sondheim stuff? That was, after all, his first Broadway show. He only wrote musicals for another 60 years after that. Sondheim did seem to improve his accent writing. I believe he used it more subtly but more consistently in his later works. But he would continue to demonstrate that he hadn't researched the accents enough in those works. For example, in Sweeney Todd, he rhymes glancing, dancing, and man sing. And this is actually really cool for other reasons, but the point here is that he messed up. The accents used in Sweeney Todd are largely Cockney accents, spoken by the lower class of London. Glancing and dancing rhyme in Cockney, they're pronounced glancing and dancing. But they don't rhyme with man sing, which is still pronounced man sing. This is another instance of a lyricist showing that he doesn't actually speak the accents his characters speak. Now, I'm not saying this to say that Sondheim and Hammerstein were terrible lyricists. They're two of my absolute favorites. I'm just demonstrating how hard it is to actually capture realism. How did other lyricists do it? Well, Tim Rice wrote lots of characters who weren't British, though he was British himself. He didn't bother with accents. I suppose that's easier than trying and messing them up. It's certainly easier on the ear than having an incorrectly written accent, and a lot of audience members might not think twice about the Argentine characters speaking with British accents. And they will be British accents. Tim Rice demonstrates the problem of not writing the characters' accents. They will be stuck with the accent of the lyricist. Pick a show by Rice: Evita, Jesus Christ Superstar, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. All full of rhymes that work in Rice's accent and nowhere else. His musicals are widespread, so now we get American singers dealing with rhyming fire and Messiah, or farmers and pajamas, while usually not being instructed to actually put on a British accent. It drives me crazy when they mess up those rhymes, and it's almost inevitable based on the productions I've seen. Anyway, I find it ironic that Tim Rice criticized lyricists for writing lyrics that don't suit their characters, while not making his own lyrics phonetically fit the time and place of his musicals. I'm not really criticizing him for this. Writing accents is hard. And doing it wrong, which feels almost inevitable, is generally going to be perceived worse than not doing it at all. But there's a lack of immersion there. And there are plenty of other lyricists who don't write the accents for their characters. Les Miserables is hilariously British sounding for being written by a couple of French guys. I know there was at least one British lyricist involved, being Herbert Kretzmer, who did a fantastic job translating and rewriting the lyrics from the original French. I'm just saying, they did not go for a French sound at all in the translation. Neither does Phantom of the Opera sound French. The list goes on. So, many lyricists have decided that the line for realism does not cross into accent writing. But what about the rest of the characters' dialects? A dialect isn't just the accent, the way the characters pronounce their words. It's also including the word choices and the way that those words fit together. Maybe the Anita example would have been more of a dialect choice. I don't know. Because talking about how words fit together. I could talk more about how the accents work for West Side Story, where, like, for example, he rhymes Maria and Sia, in I Feel Pretty, and that's not an accurate pronunciation for a Puerto Rican Spanish speaker, most likely. They would probably be able to pronounce the H, because the H sound actually does exist in Puerto Rican Spanish. But that would be another example of accents in Sondheim's work. But let's talk about dialects in general. So back to West Side Story. Stephen Sondheim and Arthur Lawrence, who wrote the script, chose to create a lot of the slang that the Jets used for two reasons. One, to not misuse real teen slang and look stupid. And two, to prevent it from feeling dated quickly. I don't know that worked, because I feel like the Jets' slang, while iconic but kind of stupid sounding, just feels like 1950s slang that I wasn't exposed to elsewhere. But they had an interesting point. The words that the lyricists pick are very important. Let's fast forward to the 21st century. The most prominent lyricist of this generation is Lin-Manuel Miranda. He seems to mostly write the English that he himself uses. It's full of rhymes that only work in New York. There's lots of slang and terminology from Hispanic-influenced English, hip-hop culture, and other elements of his own background. This includes very modern, very relevant words. This may have made In the Heights and Hamilton feel fresh when they hit the stage, but will it make them feel dated in 20 years? I'd argue there are bits of these shows that already feel dated. In the Heights feels like it's written in the early 2000s, with language choices in it. But let's look at other musicals that use lots of modern slang. Six is more recent than Hamilton, but I think it already feels more dated because of how much slang it uses that we just don't use much anymore. Most slang words only last a little while, so it's unsurprising that some of Six's word choices haven't held up. Six is actually a really interesting show to bring up in the topic of realism. Like Rice's works, and I believe Miranda's works as well, the actors aren't instructed to put on specific accents, but the accents are baked into the rhymes. But I'm not going to rehash that bit. Six is interesting because it is so popular and so unrealistic in its use of language. I guess the language fits the characters in the sense that the characters are historical figures reincarnated as members of a 2010s girl group. So maybe it's not that unrealistic. But when you first watch it expecting, Tudor English, right? This is very, very different from what you would expect, what you get in Six. Anyway, that wraps it up for today. Thanks for listening to this rambling on realism and musical theater lyrics. I hope it was entertaining and informative.